For 20 years, a valley in the northern mountains called an old trapper, a monster, and shut its doors to him, and let its children throw stones at his gate.
Every foot of this valley belonged to the man you called a monster, ma'am. And he left it to the child.
He'll skin you, Wren. Everybody knows it. That's the monster's stone. The boy said it from a safe distance, back where the pines closed over the trail, because that was as far up the mountain as any child in Harrow Hollow would go. The girl did not turn around. She knelt at the flat grey stone by the trapper's gate, worn smooth on top, the way a doorstep wears smooth, and set the potato down, careful, the way you set down a thing still too hot to hold. Steam came off it into the blue cold of the dusk. He's not, she said. He is. He ate a man once, my pa said. Your pa says lots of things. Wren stood and wiped her hands on a dress that had been 3 other girls' dresses before it was hers, and she looked at the potato on the stone the way you look at a letter you have finished writing. Then she turned and walked back down the trail, past the boy, who scrambled out of her way as though thinness might be catching. Here is the thing the boy never saw, because he was already running. In the black square of the cabin doorway, back where the firelight did not reach, something moved. A shape too big for a man, or so the valley always said. A shoulder, the ruined half of a face, one pale eye gone milky as a winter moon. It did not step out. It made no sound. It only stood and watched the small figure go down until the trees had taken her, and watched the empty trail a while longer than made any sense. And when the dusk had gone fully to dark, a huge hand, scarred across the back, reached out of that doorway and set something small on the stone, beside where the potato had been. Then the door closed, the latch fell, and Harrow Hollow lay quiet below, certain it knew exactly what lived at the top of that trail. You should know the girl before you know anything else, because everything in this story is a thing she saw. Her name was Wren. She was 11 years old, and she belonged to no one. 2 winters before, a fever had come down the valley the way fevers did in those years, and it had taken her mother in the space of a week and her father a few days behind, and left Wren standing in a doorway that was no longer hers, while grown men argued in the yard over who would take the plow and who the goats. Nobody argued over the girl. So she was passed. That is the only word for it. From the Kellermans to the Otts, to the Widow Sykes, and back again. A season here, a winter there, wherever a house had a corner to spare and a chore that wanted doing. She was fed last and least, and wore what the other children had worn out, and learned to be quiet in the particular way of a child who has understood young, that she is a thing tolerated rather than a person wanted, that the safest child is the one nobody remembers, is in the room. By that second winter, Wren had gone nearly invisible in Harrow Hollow. The valley believed it looked after its orphan, but a child can starve slowly in a place that believes it is kind, and no one has to be a villain for it to happen. It happens by everyone looking a little to the left of her, for a long enough time. There was one man in the valley who did not look to the left of her, and that was worse. Deacon Pruitt kept the store, and the store kept the valley, for a man who owned the flour and the powder and the only certified scales for 40 miles, owned a good deal more than flour and powder. Pruitt was not a cruel man. and it is important that you do not make him one. He was a careful man. He believed in accounts that balanced, in property honestly held, in charity given to those who had earned the right to need it. He gave to the orphan. He would have been offended past speech if you had said he did not. But he gave the way he weighed sugar. Wren would come to the counter with a chore done, and Pruitt would take down the scoop, and there would be a lesson pressed into every ounce. A body has to be worth her keep in this world, he would say, leveling the scoop with one finger, letting a few grains fall back into the barrel. Charities for the deserving. You remember that, and you'll do fine. Wren remembered it the way you remember a stone in your shoe. She carried her half scoop of meal down the road and was hungry again before the light was gone, and Deacon Pruitt went home to a full table, certain he had done right by the girl, because he had, by every measure he owned. And up the mountain, at the top of the trail no child would climb, there was the other thing the valley was certain about. They called him the monster. Most had never once used the name they must have known he had. Silas Rourke, the old one said, when they said anything. But a name is a thing you give a man you count as your own, and Harrow Hollow had never counted him. He was the trapper, the leather man, the thing at the top of the trail. He was enormous and silent, and half his face was a ruin of white scar, where, the story went, a grizzly had opened him from brow to jaw and lived to regret it, or did not live, depending on who was telling. One eye had gone pale and blind in that ruin. He came down into the valley, perhaps 4 times a year, for salt and powder and lead, and laid his coin on Pruitt's counter without a word, and carried his goods back up the mountain. And the street emptied ahead of him like water before the prow of a boat. The children dared each other to run up and slap a hand against his gate and run back down. None of them ever saw him. And out of that, out of a scarred silence that never once explained itself, the valley built the man it needed him to be. They said he had killed a man in the mountains. They said the wolves came to his door like dogs. They said, when a calf went missing, that it was the monster, though the monster had never in 20 years been known to take a thing that was not his. It is easy to make a monster out of a silence. You have only to fill it with your own fear. Now you are wondering why a girl would climb, every dusk, to leave a hot potato at a monster's gate. I will tell you, because Wren herself never would. It was the first winter she was truly orphaned, and there had come a stretch when no house would take her. A hard month when she passed her nights in the Ott's cold barn, and was forgotten at meals more often than not. And one white afternoon, light-headed with hunger, she wandered up the mountain trail without quite meaning to, until the cold and the emptiness in her folded her down into the snow, and she went out like a candle, a stone's throw from the trapper's gate. She should have died. A child down in the snow at dusk in those mountains does not, as a rule, get up again. She woke in warmth, to the smell of a rabbit, turning over a fire, the weight of a fur heavier than any blanket she had known, a low room gone amber with firelight. She was inside the cabin at the top of the trail, and across that fire, not looking at her, working a knife over a small piece of wood, with hands the size of dinner plates, sat the monster. He never said a word to her. He fed her the rabbit. When her strength came back, in the grey of the next morning, he opened the door and stood aside. and she understood she was to go. Down the mountain, and back into a valley that greeted her return with a shudder. "Lucky you got out alive," the widow Sykes said, crossing herself. "He was fattening you, girl. That's what his kind do." Wren knew better. She had lain warm under his fur and seen there was nothing in that cabin to fear. And from that day, though she could not have put the why of it into words, being a child and not given to words, she began to climb the trail at dusk and leave a little of what little she had on the flat stone by his gate. It was the only thanks she had, so she gave it and told no one, and the valley thought her half mad for it, the days it thought of her at all. For a long while the stone gave nothing back. She left the food. By morning it was gone. That was all, and that was enough. Then came the evening she climbed up through a thin new snow and found on the flat grey stone where she was about to set her potato that something was already there. It was small. It was pale against the dark stone. She picked it up with cold fingers and turned it to the last of the light, and her breath caught. It was a bird. A little bird carved out of pale wood, no bigger than the top joint of her thumb, and carved with a care that stopped her heart. The round breast, the folded wings, the cock of the head, the tiny scored lines that were feathers. It was a wren. He had carved her a wren. It sat in the cup of her palm, light as a real bird and warmer somehow, for having been made, and Wren stood in the falling snow and looked at the first thing anyone in the whole cold world had made for her since her mother died. She did not go up and knock. She understood, in the wordless way she understood most things, that the knocking was not the point. She set down the potato where the bird had been, folded the little wooden bird into her fist, and carried it down the mountain against her heart. That was the beginning of it. Not a friendship, for they never spoke. Something quieter and older, with no name the valley would ever have believed. A hot thing left on a cold stone, a small carved thing left in its place, back and forth, dusk after dusk, without one word ever passing between them. After the wren came a fox. She found it a week on, a little wooden fox, with its brush curled round its feet, sly and perfect, set on the stone in the wren's place. Through the deep of that winter, the stone gave and gave. She would leave the food and find, some evenings, a carved thing waiting. A bear, a leaping trout, a doe with her ears laid back to listen. And once, on a night so cold the trees cracked like gunshots in the dark, she came out at first light to find her own woodpile, stacked full and neat against the shed wall. Split fine, squared, more than a week of it, and no track to say whose hands had done it, for the new snow had smoothed the world to a blank white page. Wren looked at that wood a long time. She never asked. She thought she knew. By the end of that winter, there was a row of small carved animals along the sill of whatever window she was staying under. A wren, a fox, a bear, a trout, a doe. They went with her, house to house, wrapped in a rag, the only luggage that was truly her own. Those animals were, if you did the honest sum, everything Wren owned in the world. No house, no land, no people. The clothes the valley had worn out on other children, a rag doll with its face rubbed away, and a row of small wooden creatures a monster had carved in the dark and left on a stone for her to find. At night she would set them along the sill in their order and touch each one, for she had given each a name, and the names were a secret she kept the way other children keep a locket. The wren she called small. The fox she called sly. The bear she called warm, because it was the biggest. And she had decided the biggest thing should be a kind thing in at least one world. She did not know the man's history, not his name, nor where he had come from, nor what had put the ruin in his face and the silence in his mouth. She knew only what the stone told her, dusk after dusk, in the one language they shared. I see you. You are not nothing. Somebody made a thing for you today. In a valley that had spent 2 years looking a little to the left of her. That was a great deal to know. It was, some days, the only thing that kept her lit. Not one word had ever passed between them. Not one. And it did not need to. The valley, of course, had opinions, for a valley always does. And they came in 3 kinds, each of which the story will ask you to remember later. The first was pity, and it came, as pity often does, from the softest and most useless quarter. Poor little stray, the women said over their wash, watching her climb the trail at dusk with her handful of supper. No mother to teach her sense, carrying good food up to that creature. Grief turns a child queer. They said it the way you speak of a lamb gone off with the wrong flock. Soft, sorry, and without the least intention of doing one thing about it. It cost them nothing, changed nothing, warmed no one, least of all the girl on the trail, who could not eat a kind word and had long ago stopped expecting to. The second was suspicion, and it had a harder edge, and it spread faster, the way the unkind thought always travels faster than the kind. But why does he feed her? The men said low by Pruitt's stove. You don't do a thing for nothing in this life. That old leather devil's got no use for a child, unless he's got a use for a child, if you take my meaning. And they would go quiet and let the ugliest version fill the silence, because a man who has decided another man is a monster will reach for the monstrous answer every time, and never once notice. He put it there himself. Nobody had seen the trapper do the girl a moment's harm in 2 winters. It did not matter. The question was never really about the girl. It was about the pleasure of being afraid of him, which the valley had grown fond of, the way you grow fond of a scar. Wansie sitie, hanjul, nareteoton, sonjogag saipayo peujigu, sinten jongyolbu. If a small carved bird, left on a cold stone by a door, has you leaning a little closer, you might think about following this channel, but only once the story is good and done with you. And the third kind was plain cruelty, and it came, as it so often does, dressed as good sense, and it came from Deacon Pruitt. Wren was in the store the day she heard it, small in the corner with her half scoop of meal, and Pruitt did not trouble to lower his voice, because to lower your voice you must first believe the person in the corner can be wounded. Let her carry her scraps up the hill, and welcome, Pruitt said, leveling the scoop with his finger. That child and that beast deserve each other. 2 strays, neither one fit to sit at a Christian table, and each too proud to know it. The men laughed, the low, easy laugh of men agreeing with the man who owns the scales. And Wren tucked her chin and carried her meal out into the cold, and did not cry, for she had learned not to spend water on a thing she could not change. But she held the little wooden wren in her pocket all the way home, and thought, he is wrong about the beast. He has never once been up the hill. It did not occur to her that he was wrong about her too. She had not yet been given any reason to think so. There was one dusk that winter she saw him plain, She had climbed later than usual, the light nearly gone, and as she set the potato down, the cabin door was open, a foot of amber firelight spilling out onto the snow. And he was standing in it, not back in the dark this time. In the doorway, filling it, the ruin of his face turned full toward her in the last blue light, the white seam of the old wound climbing from jaw to brow, the pale blind eye, the great scarred bulk of him that the whole valley ran from. Wren did not run. She had seen him before once, from the inside of a fever, across a fire that saved her life. She looked up at him now across the little grey stone, and she was not afraid. And something in her face must have shown it. Some plain child's steadiness, because the two of them stood there a moment in the falling dark, the monster and the stray, looking at one another. Then Wren did a small thing. She dipped her head to him, a little bow, the kind you give a person. It was nothing. It was everything the valley had never once given him. What moved through the ruined face across the stone, I will not tell you, for I was not inside it, and neither was Wren. And this is only the story of what she saw. She saw him a moment longer in the doorway. Then he stepped back, and the door came quietly to, and she went down the mountain with the amber of that firelight still warm behind her eyes. There was a dog. If you had asked the valley about the monster's dog, they would have shuddered and told you it was half wolf and wholly savage, that it had run down children in the timber, that its one good eye had a green fire in it at night. Most of that was the same manufacture as the rest of him. But the dog was real and strange, and it had exactly one soft place in the whole world, and that place was Wren. It was a big grey brute, gaunt as a fence rail, one eye clouded to match its master's, as though the two of them had been through the same bad country and come out marked the same way. It never came to heel for a soul in the valley. But on the evenings Wren climbed the trail, it would come out of the timber and pace her, watching with its one good eye. And once, only once, that winter, when she stopped to shake the snow from her boot, it came and put its great scarred head against her knee, let her rest a cold hand on it, and melted back into the trees before she had drawn 3 breaths. The valley had a monster, and a stray, and a devil dog, and did not once suspect that the 3 of them, up the mountain in the dark, had quietly become the gentlest company in Harrow Hollow. The cold came down hard a second time, late that winter, the killing kind, and on the worst morning of it, Wren woke to find her woodpile stacked full against the wall. She knew this time. There was no wondering left in it. She stood in the blue dawn with her breath smoking, looked at the split wood, squared and neat, and looked up the mountain toward the timber where the trail went, and said out loud, to no one, in a voice very small in all that cold, "Thank you." Nobody answered, but the wood was there, and it burned all through the worst of that cold. And Wren lived through the winter that killed 2 calves and an old man down the valley, and she never told a living soul where her firewood came from. For she had learned that the valley took a kind thing and made it ugly, given half a chance. And she would not give them the chance. Some things you keep. She kept this the way she kept the names of the wooden animals, folded and close, and hers. You have to understand how faithful the thing was, to understand what it meant when it broke. For 2 winters, the stone had never once gone empty. She would leave the food at dusk. It would be gone by dawn. It was the one fixed and certain thing in a life that had no others, surer than a meal, a bed, or the affection of any grown person in Harrow Hollow. Whatever else the world took from her, the stone kept faith. Then came the evening she climbed the trail and found last night's potato still sitting there, cold, untouched, a little cap of new snow on top of it. Wren stood very still. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. There had always been smoke. In 2 winters, morning or evening, always a thread of wood smoke standing up over that cabin into the mountain sky. There was none now. The cabin sat grey and cold against the grey, cold trees, and the stone held its untouched food. And the whole top of the mountain had gone quiet in a way that Wren, who knew the world without words, understood before she let herself understand it. She did not knock that night. She was afraid, and she was 11, and she went back down the mountain, telling herself he had gone to check a far line, that the smoke would be there tomorrow. The smoke was not there tomorrow. And on the second morning of the cold and empty stone, Wren woke in the grey before dawn, to a sound she had never once heard in the valley. A low, broken whining, right outside the lean-to door. She opened it, and there on the frozen ground, gaunt and shivering and alone, sat the one-eyed dog. It had come down the mountain. In 2 winters, it had never come down the mountain. It sat at her door in the dark and whined, low, and would not be hushed. And when she took a step up the trail, it rose at once and went ahead of her, looking back, the way a dog waits when it needs you to follow, and cannot say so. Wren's heart had gone to cold water in her chest, because she knew this dog. She knew the one true thing about it. The whole slandering valley had never troubled to learn. That in all the years anyone had known of the trapper on the mountain, through all that cold, that dog had never once, not for an hour, left his side. It had left his side now. Come back, child. Leave the dead be. The kind woman, her name was Ada Coyle, and you should hold on to her, for this story is going to hand her something before the end, had come up the road at the tail of the dog and caught Wren by the trailhead, one hand on the girl's thin shoulder. Half the valley had gathered at the foot of the mountain by then, drawn by the strange sight of the monster's dog come down alone. None of them would climb. They stood in a loose, muttering crowd where the pines closed over the path, exactly as far as the children ever dared, and no farther. Wren shrugged the hand off, gently, the way you refuse a thing without wanting to wound the one offering it. He's not the dead, she said. He's got a name, and he's mine to see to. And she went up the trail with the one-eyed dog at her side, 11 years old and no bigger than a fence post, up into the timber where no grown man in Harrow Hollow would set his boot, to do the last kind thing that anyone would do for Silas Rourke, because she was the only one who had ever done the first. The door was not latched. It swung in under her hand, and the cabin breathed out at her, cold. That was the first wrongness, cold where there had always been warmth. The great hearth that had saved her life 2 winters gone was grey and dead, the ash long settled, no ember left anywhere in it. He was in his chair beside it. He had not fallen. That was the thing Wren would carry the rest of her life, the small mercy of it. He had not fallen. He had not fought. He sat in the chair by the cold hearth, as though he had merely set down his day. His great scarred hands loose in his lap, his chin dropped, the ruined face gone quiet and almost young in its stillness. The one-eyed dog crossed the floor and lay down against his boots with a sound low in its chest and would not move again. And in his open hand, half finished, the knife laid down beside it, was a small piece of pale wood. He had been carving when it took him. Wren crossed the cold room and knelt at his knee and took the little thing up out of his palm. And she saw what it was going to be. It was going to be a girl. A small carved girl, roughed out but unmistakable. The last thing his hands had shaped in this world. She knelt there on the floor of the cabin, the only soul in all the valley who had come. And she put her forehead against his cold sleeve. And she wept as she had not let herself weep for her own mother and father. Wept for the silent man who had left a bird on a stone and had no one else in the whole wide world to weep for him but a stray. Understand what that was, that weeping. It was the whole of his funeral. There would be no bell rung for Silas Rourke, no words spoken over him by the valley's minister, no procession, no covered dishes carried to a grieving house. In all of Harrow Hollow, in a place his hands had, though not one of them yet knew it, carried through the mountains alive, there was exactly one heart that broke at his going, and it was the smallest and the poorest and the least regarded heart in the whole valley. The stray wept for the monster. The dog kept its head against his boots. Outside, the wind moved in the high timber, and the cold came down off the peaks, and the valley below went about its evening certain that a bad thing had been taken out of the world, and never once suspecting it had lost the best man in it. They would not touch him. Wren went down at dark and told them he was dead, and asked for help to bring him down and bury him decent. And the valley, the whole gathered, muttering crowd of it, looked at its boots. Bury the monster. Carry that thing down the mountain on Christian shoulders. Lay it in Christian ground. Not a man among them would put his hand to it. They had feared him too long to stop on the day he died. A fear that old does not turn loose of a valley just because the thing it feared has gone still. Only two came. Ada Coyle came, the kind woman who had a soft place in her that the hard valley had never quite managed to close. She came with a lantern and a clean sheet and her sleeves pushed up. And the school teacher came, a spare young man named Emmett Shaw, who taught the valley's children their letters, and had always been a little apart from its cruelties, being a reading man in a place that did not read. The three of them, the woman, the schoolmaster, and the child, climbed the trail in the dark and did for Silas Rourke what the valley would not, while the valley watched their lanterns move on the mountain from below and said nothing. It was the first crack in the wall. It was small, and it was late, and it did not undo one day of 20 years. But a wall comes down the way it goes up, one stone at a time. And that night, 3 people carried the first stone away. It was while they were gathering his few things. For even a man alone must be seen to, his hearth banged, his door closed against the beasts, that Wren found the box. It was under the floor, beneath a plank worn pale by the passage of one man's boot for 20 years, in a hollow he had cut and lined and fitted with his own hands. A tin box, japanned black, the lacquer crackled with age, no bigger than a Bible. It had a small lock, and the key hung on a thong around the cold man's neck. And Wren, being the one he would have given it to, had there been any giving left in him, lifted the thong over his head with steady hands, and fitted the key and turned it. Ada held the lantern close. The schoolmaster leaned in, and the three of them looked down into the one place Silas Rourke had kept, whatever it was a monster kept. On top, folded in oilcloth against the damp, was a paper, a great stiff sheet of it, and when the schoolmaster spread it open by the lantern, he went very still. It was a land patent, a government grant, the real thing, the ink faded but the words plain, a seal pressed into the foot of it and a signature under the seal. All of it signed and sealed and witnessed in the proper way, the way the government made a man the owner of a piece of the earth. Emmett Shaw traced the boundaries out slowly, and his voice changed as he spoke them, because the boundaries did not stop. They went on. But that is a thing for the next part of the story, and I will not spoil it here. Beneath the patent was a second paper, and this one undid the valley's whole long tale of him in a single stroke. For it was a letter, a last testament, and it was written in a careful, upright, patient hand. The monster could write. The leather devil the valley had called a beast, a brute, a thing barely fit to be named among men, had sat by that hearth through 20 winters of nights, and set down his wishes in a clean and lettered hand, each word formed with the same care he gave a carved wing. Whatever else that box was going to tell them, it had already told them this. They had never once known the man they had spent 20 years being afraid of. And under the papers, wrapped small, were the things a man keeps that are worth more than land. A child's lace collar, yellowed, no bigger than would fit a small girl's neck. A lock of fair hair, fine as corn silk, tied round with a thread. And a wooden figure, a little carved girl, worn smooth and dark along its edges from years of being held. The paint long since gone from it, the oldest and most handled of all the carvings that had ever come out of that cabin. It was the same hand that had made the wren and the fox and the bear on Wren's windowsill. Anyone could see it. The same knife, the same care, the same love pressed into the grain. Only this one was old and worn and had plainly been carried in a man's pocket for a very long time, and held and held and held. Wren looked at the little worn girl in the lantern light, and she looked at the fair lock of hair, and something began to come clear to her that had no words and needed none. Here the story must go carefully, and let the things in the box do the telling. For I have promised you, I will not go inside the silent man, and I will keep that promise to the last. But the schoolmaster knew a little of the valley's own beginnings, the way a reading man knows the tale under the tale. And between the patent and the collar, and the fair hair, and the worn wooden girl, the three of them by lantern light, put together the thing that Harrow Hollow had never known about the creature at the top of its trail. There had been a first wagon train, everyone knew that much. A valley always keeps the bones of its own founding. 20 years before, a company of families had come up into these mountains looking for the low pass through, and winter had caught them early and high. And they would all have died in the snow, every soul, but that a trapper who knew the country had come down out of the timber and taken them through the killing pass, through the river, crossing swollen with ice melt, down into the green valley on the far side where they built the town that became Harrow Hollow. The valley remembered the crossing. What the valley had never once troubled to remember was the name of the man who led them. It was in the box. It was Silas Rourke. And the collar, and the fair hair, and the little worn wooden girl, told the other half, the half he had carried alone for 20 years and never said to a soul. He had not come through the crossing hole. At that river of ice, bringing other men's families to safety, he had lost his own. A wife, a daughter with fair hair, small enough for a lace collar, no bigger than your 2 hands. He had brought the valley through alive and buried his own at the water. And then he had gone up to the timberline and closed his door and let them call him whatever they needed to call him. For 20 years. And now the wooden animals made their terrible tender sense. The wren on the windowsill, the fox, the bear called warm, the doe with her ears laid back, every small carved creature that had ever appeared on the flat grey stone for a starving orphan to find. They were not new things, dreamed up for a stray. They were the same things. They were what his hands had always made, what they had made first and longest, for a fair-haired girl at that same hearth, a lifetime ago, before the crossing took her. The knife had never learned any other language. It knew only how to say, "I love you," in the shape of small animals, and it had gone on saying it, in the dark, for 20 years, to no one, until a fair-haired child had fallen starving at his gate one winter, a child the very size and colouring of the one the river took. I will not tell you what he thought when he first saw her in the snow. I have promised, and I keep faith. The box does not say, and Wren was not inside him, and neither are we. But the box says what he did. He carried her in, he fed her, he mended her fire in the night. And every dusk after, for 2 winters, he set on a cold stone the only words he had left in the world, a wren, a fox, a bear, for a girl who was, though neither of them ever once said it aloud, the echo of the one he had carried to the far bank and could not save. The schoolmaster knew what he was holding. That was the thing that turned it from a private grief into a public reckoning. Emmett Shaw held the land patent to the lantern a long moment, tracing the pressed seal with one finger, and he said quietly, "This is real. This is a proper grant, witnessed and sealed. This has to go before the circuit land agent. He comes through at the founding in the summer. A thing like this." He did not finish. He was a careful man, and he had already seen where the boundaries on that paper ran, and he did not yet trust himself to say it aloud. They took it to Pruitt first, because Pruitt was the man you took things to, and Pruitt turned the great stiff paper over in his clean hands under his good lamp and gave a short laugh through his nose. "A trapper's scrap of paper," he said, and set it down on his counter, the way you set down a thing you have finished with. Old Rourke sat up on that hill 20 years cutting whittle toys and scratching at documents like a magpie. You'd take this to a government man. He'll laugh you back down the road. Bury the creature and be done. The child's had her cry. There's no sense making a spectacle of it. And he pushed the paper back across the counter and went to weigh out a customer's nails, certain, as he was always certain, that he knew the exact worth of everything that had ever been set before him on that counter. He did not, but that too is for the summer. They buried him high on the mountain, in the timber above the cabin, in ground the schoolmaster, and the woman broke with their own hands while the valley kept its distance. And Wren, who had no words for grief and had never been given any, mourned him in the only language she had ever shared with him. She kept feeding the stone. Every dusk, as she had for 2 winters, she climbed the trail and set a little of her supper on the flat grey stone by his gate. Though the gate opened now on a cold and empty cabin, and nothing would ever again come out of the dark to take the food or leave a small thing in its place. She knew that. She did it anyway. It was the shape her love had learned, and love does not unlearn its shape in a day. The food sat on the stone through the night, and the frost took it, and she came back the next dusk and set down more. Ada Coyle watched her do it from the foot of the trail and had to turn her face away, because there are some kinds of faithfulness that are almost too much to look at straight. She had the last carving, the half-made girl from his open hand. She kept that against her heart, wrapped in the rag with the others. But there was another unfinished thing in the cabin, a little bird roughed out on the workbench, one wing shaped, and the other still only a promise in the wood, the knife lying across it where he had set it down for the last time. Wren took up the bird and the knife, and she tried to finish it herself. She was no carver. Her hands were a child's hands, and the knife was too big, and the first wing she cut came out clumsy and thick, beside the fine true wing his hands had made. You could see the two of them plain, the master's wing and the child's, on the one small bird. She nicked her fingers. She tried again, and slowly, badly, lovingly, over many evenings, by a fire she had learned at last to build in his hearth, Wren finished the trapper's last bird. Not well, not the way he would have, but finished, so that the thing his hands had begun did not have to stay forever half-made in the world. It was the ugliest of all her wooden birds. It was the one she would keep the longest. She took to staying up on the mountain. The valley thought it strange, of course, a child of 11 passing her nights alone in the monster's cabin with the monster's dog. But the valley had thought her strange for 2 years, and Wren had stopped weighing her life on the valley's scales. She kept his house. She built up his fire and swept his floor and set his few things in order. The carvings along the sill, the tin box on the table, the great fur that had once been laid over her folded, now across the foot of his empty chair. The one-eyed dog stayed at her side through the long nights, and would take food from her hand and no other, and the two of them kept the cabin the way you keep a thing you mean to give back, though there was no one left to give it back to. She was guarding it. She did not have the word for what she guarded, but she felt in her child's bones that the tin box on the table mattered, that the great stiff paper mattered, that Deacon Pruitt was wrong to laugh, and that a day was coming when someone would have to answer for the man on the mountain. So she kept his house, and she kept his box, and she waited for the summer without knowing that was what she was doing. Down in the valley, the muttering had changed its shape. It had been, "Why does the monster feed her?" Now, since the schoolmaster would not let the thing alone, since Ada Coyle had told 2 women, and 2 women are a valley's whole newspaper, it had become something else, and it had a cold worm of unease in the middle of it. If that paper's real, you would hear it at Pruitt's stove, low. If the old leather devil truly held a grant. Shaw says the boundary lines don't stop, says they run on past the church glebe. That can't be. A man doesn't sit up a mountain 20 years in rags on top of a fortune. Can he? Could he? And they would look at each other, the men who had run him off their doorsteps and set their children to daring his gate, and a small unfamiliar coldness would move through the room, and someone would change the subject, because there are questions a valley would rather not carry to their end. The winter broke at last, the way that country's winters broke, all at once, the ice going off the high creeks with a sound like distant cannon, the trail turning to mud, the passes opening one by one to the low country and the wide world beyond. And with the thaw, word went out. The schoolmaster wrote a careful letter in his careful hand and sent it down the first open pass to the county seat, addressed to the circuit land agent who rode the mountain valleys each summer to settle the estates of the dead and the disputes of the living, and to make the government's cold accounts balance in places 2 days from anywhere. He wrote that a man had died holding a patent. He wrote out the boundaries as he had traced them off the great stiff paper. And then Harrow Hollow could do nothing but wait for summer, and for the man the summer would bring, and for the box on the table in the dead man's cabin to be opened at last, in front of them all. The land agent came up the valley road on the morning of the founding, when the country had gone full green and gold with high summer, and the valley had gathered to mark the day 20 years on that its grandfathers had come through the pass alive. He came the way such men come, unhurried, dust on his coat, a locked case of ledgers across his saddle, the particular patience of a man who has never once been talked out of a boundary line. And Deacon Pruitt went out to meet him on the road and shook his hand and walked him up toward the gathering with an easy, proprietary hand on his own lapel, certain as he had ever been of anything, that this dusty man of documents was about to laugh a dead trapper's scrap of paper out of the valley and put a foolish orphan's claim to rest, and that the founding would go on as it always had, with the right people standing where the right people had always stood. The valley waited to be told the paper meant nothing. It was about to be told otherwise. The land agents come to settle the monster's estate, and they say the stray's got some fool claim to it. The man called it out off the notice tacked to Pruitt's door for the benefit of the little crowd that had gathered on founding morning, and there was a laugh in the way he said it. The comfortable laugh of a valley that already knew how the day would end. A dead trapper, a cabin full of whittle toys, a ragged orphan with a scrap of paper and a schoolmaster's fancy. It would be settled by noon, they told each other, and then there would be the founding to celebrate, the bonfire and the long tables, the 20-year telling of how their grandfathers came through the pass. They were in high spirits. It was a green and golden morning, the valley at the full of its short mountain summer, and they filed up toward the meeting hall, the way you go to watch a thing you are sure will amuse you. At the back of the crowd, alone but for a gaunt, one-eyed dog, a fair-haired girl came down off the mountain, carrying a black tin box in both arms, and no one thought to help her with it. And no one yet understood that she was carrying the deed to the ground under all their feet. They filled the meeting hall wall to wall, the whole of Harrow Hollow, because a founding is the one day the far cabins come in. And because there is nothing a valley loves like watching a matter settled. The land agent sat at the long table at the front with his ledgers open and his spectacles down his nose. Deacon Pruitt stood near him, easy, a host at his own party, ready to lend the weight of his good name to the sensible outcome. Ada Coyle and the schoolmaster had brought the girl to the front and stood on either side of her like two thin walls. and in the middle of the table, black and crackled and small, sat the tin box, its lid up, the great stiff paper folded on top. The agent called the room to order. He had a dry, unhurried voice, the voice of a man who reads land grants the way other men read the weather. And he took up the folded patent and he opened it. And he began, for the record, he said, so that all present would hear it plainly, to lay out what the paper was. The valley settled in to be amused. This grant, the agent said, was patented to one Silas Rourke and signed and sealed by the government of the United States in consideration of services rendered, namely the safe conduct of the first settlement company through the mountain pass in the founding winter at the peril of his own life. He paused and turned the paper to the lamp and traced the boundary lines with one dry finger. And it is a large grant. I will read you its bounds. He spoke them out slowly, and as he spoke, the amusement went out of the room like heat out of an open door. The lines did not stop at the timberline. They did not stop at the creek or the church glebe or the far fence of the last homestead. They ran the whole valley, ridge to ridge, pass to pass, every foot of it. The meeting hall they were sitting in, the church, Pruitt's store and Pruitt's fine house, the homesteads, the fields, the road, the graveyard, every roof in Harrow Hollow, the agent said, laying the paper flat, stood on land that had belonged all along for 20 years to the man they had called a monster. He held the ground under this whole valley, the agent said into a silence gone total. He could have put any one of you off it, any day he chose, for 20 years. Turned you out lawful, with the government at his back. He never did. He never took 1 cent of rent from a living soul. He sat up that mountain in rags and let you build your lives on his land, and let you call him what you called him, and never once told you whose ground you stood on. Nobody moved. The whole valley sat frozen in that hall, in the green gold light of the founding morning, and understood at last that the man at the top of the trail, the leather devil, the thing they had run from and set their children to daring, had been the entire time the reason each of them had a floor beneath their feet. There is a testament, the agent said, when he judged the silence had gone long enough. I will read it as it is written. It is short. He took up the second paper, the one in the careful, upright, patient hand, and he spoke the dead man's own words aloud into the hall. The only time Silas Rourke's voice would ever be heard in the valley he had made. And it came a year too late, and out of a stranger's mouth. I, Silas Rourke, being of sound mind and alone in the world, leave the whole of my land, and all that is on it, held by the grant, herewith, to the only soul in this valley who ever knocked kindly at my gate, the orphan child called Wren, who left food on my stone when no one had a kind word for either of us. It is all hers. Let no one gainsay it. The agent turned the page. There was more, and the more was the thing that changed everything. One charge I lay upon her, and upon whoever comes after, that no family now settled on this land be ever put off it, nor charged 1 cent for the ground they hold, so long as the mountains stand. They did not know the land was mine. Let them keep their homes. I would not take from any child of this valley the thing that was taken from mine. Now think for a moment what that will did in that hall, to that valley. Every soul in Harrow Hollow had, the moment the boundaries were spoken, felt the ground tilt under them, felt in one cold rush, that they were trespassers on a dead man's charity, that the child at the front of the room now held the lawful power to turn every one of them out of house and field, exactly as they had turned her guardian from door to door for 20 years. For one held breath, the whole valley waited to be paid back in its own coin. It would have been just. Every measure of justice they owned said it would be just. And the dead man's own hand had already closed that door. Let no one be put off. Let them keep their homes. There was to be no turning out. There was to be no reckoning of that kind. The one soul in the valley who now had every earthly right to revenge had been forbidden it, tenderly in advance by the very man they had wronged, and forbidden it for the gentlest of reasons, that he could not bear to take from any other child what the river had taken from his own. The reversal, when it landed not as a blade but as a covering. It fell over the valley the way his fur had once fallen over a freezing child, a warmth laid on the undeserving. And there is no wound so hard to bear for a proud people as being covered when they had braced to be struck. The silence broke the way ice breaks, from one small sound spreading. An old man near the back got slowly to his feet. He was one of the oldest in the valley, old enough to have come through the pass himself as a boy, and his voice shook. He carried my father through that crossing, the old man said, on his own back, the last mile, when my father's legs gave out in the snow. I was 7 years old, and I saw him do it. And I have passed that man on the road for 20 years and crossed to the other side. I never once thanked him, not once. He sat down heavily and put his face in his hands, an old man weeping at a founding, and no one thought it strange, for the same thing was rising now in every chest in the hall. Ada Coyle stood, the kind woman who had climbed the trail in the dark when the valley would not. The winter my husband died, she said, her voice steady, though her eyes were not. I woke 3 mornings running to firewood stacked at my door, split and squared and more than I could use. I thought it was the valley being good to a widow. I told myself it was the valley. She looked at the tin box on the table and at the fair-haired child beside her. An understanding moved across her face like weather. It wasn't the valley. The valley never brought me a stick. It was him. It was always him. And I never knew whose hand it was. And now I can't ever thank it. And she put her arm around the girl beside her and drew her in. And the drawing in was the beginning of something the story will finish in a moment. The schoolmaster stood last, and he did the thing a reading man does. He went to the fact. He took up the patent from the table, and he spoke its date aloud into the hall, the day and the month and the year. The government had made Silas Rourke the owner of the valley, and then he let the number settle on them. That is older, he said quietly, than the church, older than the store, older than any deed any one of you holds or thinks you hold. By this paper, this valley began with his name on it. And every year we have counted sins. We have counted wrong. We did not come here and let a monster live at the edge of us. He came here and made a place a valley could live in. And let us call the edge of it the center. He set the paper down. We owe him the founding itself. And the wall came down. Not a stone of it left standing. 20 years of manufactured fear, of children daring a gate, of a name no one would use. All of it gone in the space of a single reading. and every face in Harrow Hollow turned at last toward the small, fair-haired figure at the front, who had known the truth of him longer than any of them, that there had never been a monster on the mountain at all. And Deacon Pruitt. He had stood the whole time near the table, and the story owes you the truth of him now, for it has promised from the start not to make him a villain, and not to hand you the pleasure of his punishment. Pruitt was not turned out. He was not ruined, not shamed before the valley, not made to pay. The dead man's covenant covered him exactly as it covered the rest. Let them keep their homes. And that was the whole of his sentence, and it was the heaviest thing that could have been laid on such a man. Because Deacon Pruitt had rationed that child's bread by the ounce. He had leveled the scoop with his finger and told her charity was for the deserving. He had said in his own store that the child and the beast deserved each other. And now he stood in a hall and learned that his fine house, his store, his good name, the whole solid platform of his respectable life, had rested all along on the free gift of the two strays he had despised, and that the child he had grudged half a scoop of meal could have put him in the road, and would not, because the monster had asked her not to. There was nothing to strike at. There was only the mercy and the long, cold understanding of what he had been. He took off his hat. That was all. In a hall full of weeping, he took off his hat and held it against his chest, and looked at the floor of the building that stood on Silas Rourke's ground, and no one needed to say a word to him, and no punishment anyone could have devised would have reached as deep as the thing that was happening quietly behind his eyes. A hard man is not broken by being struck. He is broken by being forgiven a debt he cannot pay. Pruitt had just been forgiven his by a dead man and a child, and he would be a long time learning how to stand up under it. Then Ada Coyle knelt down in front of the girl, there in the full hall, and took both the child's thin hands in hers. "You'll not go back to a borrowed corner," she said, "not ever again. You've a home, and it's mine, and you're my own from this day, if you'll have a plain woman for a mother." And Wren, who had been passed house to house for 2 winters, who had been fed last and least, who had gone nearly invisible in a valley that believed itself kind. Wren, who owned the ground under every one of them, and wanted none of it, wanted only this, put her face against the kind woman's shoulder, and was, for the first time since the fever took her people, held by someone who meant to keep her. The valley made a sound then, all together, that a valley rarely makes, a low, broken murmur that was half shame and half a kind of joy, the sound of a hard people watching a wrong begin, at last, to be set right. The schoolmaster stood witness to it, as he had witnessed all of it, the man who had traced the truth off the paper. And the orphan of Harrow Hollow, who an hour before had belonged to no one, had in the space of one summer morning become both the richest soul in the valley, and far more than that, the first thing she had wanted to be in 2 long years, somebody's child. She kept the cabin. Of all the valley that was now hers, the fields, the store's ground, the road, the whole green gold sweep of it, the only part Wren ever truly lived in was the 1-room cabin at the top of the trail, with its great hearth and its worn pale plank, and its flat grey stone by the gate. She moved her wooden animals up to its windowsill at last, into the house where they had been made. The wren she called Small, the fox called Sly, the bear called Warm, the doe, the trout. and the ugly half-finished bird she had carved herself. They sat in a row in the amber firelight, in their true home, and now she knew. She had known since the lantern found the little warm girl in the box, whose love had made every one of them, and for whom, and how far it had traveled to reach her. The one-eyed dog lived out its years at her hearth, and never once left her side, the way it had never once left his. They gave him back his name. You cannot unsay 20 years of a word like monster all at once, but a valley can begin, and Harrow Hollow began that summer. The pass their grandfathers came through. They called it Rourke's Pass now, and do to this day. The river of ice that had taken his wife and his fair-haired girl became Rourke's Crossing. The mountain over the cabin took his name, and the creek, and in time a whole spread of that high country wore the name of the man the valley had run from, so that the very children who had dared his gate grew old, telling their own children they had been born and raised in Rourke's Valley, under Rourke's Mountain, by Rourke's Water, and half forgot there had ever been another word for him at all. That is how a place remembers. It is slow, and it is late, and it comes too late for the man himself. But the mountains kept his name 100 years in the end, the name of the man who had kept that door alone for 20. It was not nothing. It was not enough. It was what there was. And the founding day itself changed its meaning quietly from that summer on. It had always been the day the valley told how its grandfathers came through the pass. Now it became the day they told who brought them. The trapper who came down out of the timber into a killing winter and led a company of strangers through the snow and buried his own family at the water and asked nothing and was thanked with 20 years of a name that was not his. The monster became, in the valley's own telling, the founder. Children who would never see his face learned his name first among the names of the valley, the way you learn the name of the one who made the thing you stand on. And the story of the stray who fed his stone became the best loved part of it, the part the little ones asked for, the part that made the old ones go quiet. How the whole valley had missed the truth, and one hungry child had not. The years went on, the way years do in a green valley under a mountain that wears a good man's name. Wren grew up. She grew up kind, as the badly used sometimes do, and sometimes, God knows, do not. She chose it, the way her guardian had chosen the timberline, the way Ada Coyle had chosen to climb a trail in the dark. She kept the covenant to the letter all her life. Not one family was ever put off the land. Not one cent of rent ever asked, so that a stranger passing through Harrow Hollow would never have guessed that the quiet woman up the mountain owned the ground he walked on, any more than the valley had ever guessed it of the man before her. She kept his house. She kept his box. She kept, above all, the one thing the whole valley had needed 20 years, and a death to learn. And every founding day, for the rest of her long life, Wren climbed higher than the cabin, up into the timber, where 3 people had broken the ground with their own hands, to the flat stone that marked the grave of Silas Rourke. And on that stone, as once a lifetime before on the flat grey stone by his gate, she set down food, a little of the best of what she had, and beside it she set a small bird she had carved herself with her own 2 hands over the long winter evenings, each year a new one, each year a little truer than the last, for she had taught herself his craft at last and grown almost worthy of it. food on a stone, and a wooden bird beside it, given to someone who could no longer take either. It was the same language it had always been. It said the same thing it had always said, the only thing it had ever needed to say, back and forth between a silent man and a hungry child across 2 winters, and then across all the years after. I see you. You were never nothing. Somebody was thinking of you today. The frost would take the food up there, as it always had. The wooden birds she left where they lay, and they weathered grey on the gravestone, a whole flock of them by the end, small and true, keeping their watch on the mountain. They called him a monster for 20 years, and named their mountains after him for 100. That is the whole of the story, or nearly. A silent man lost everything at a river of ice, and went up a mountain to be alone with it. A valley he had saved decided he was a beast, because a silence is an easy thing to fill with your own fear, and never once climbed the trail to learn it was wrong. And one child, the poorest, the least, the one nobody kept, climbed it every dusk with a hot potato and asked nothing and got back, one small carved animal at a time, the only inheritance that ever truly mattered, the knowledge that she was seen. Everything else, the land and the name and the home and the mother, came after, and came because of that. It all grew out of food left on a cold stone by a child who did not know she was doing anything but saying thank you. So remember the stone. Remember that the valley's whole reckoning turned on it, and that neither of them ever said a word. Kindness, once left at the door, keeps its own accounts, quietly, and for longer than you would think, and it pays them in full when you have long stopped watching for the change. Ending imagery. 오두막 화덕이 아니라 문 앞에 평평한 돌. 그 위에 김나는 감자 하나와 손으로 깎은 작은 나무새 하나. 여름 저물녘빛. 채널 연속 모티프 변주. 2곰 우체국 램프. 2곰4 문 앞에 돌.